The fluorescent lights of Boston General Hospital's emergency department buzzed overhead as Dr. Eleanor Mitchell strode through the crowded waiting area. Her crisp white coat, adorned with the hospital's emblem and her name embroidered in blue, commanded respect from everyone she passed. At 42, she'd built her reputation through 15 years of uncompromising standards and groundbreaking research in cardiology. Boston General was her kingdom, and she ruled it with clinical precision. Dr. Mitchell, trauma coming in. ETA 3 minutes, called Sandra, the charge nurse, her voice cutting through the chaos of the emergency room. Eleanor nodded curtly, checking her watch. 2:17 a.m. She'd been on shift for nearly 14 hours, and the exhaustion was beginning to seep into her bones. The coffee in her system had long since worn off, replaced by the mechanical efficiency she'd developed over years of demanding shifts. "What do we have?" she asked, pulling on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. "Multi-car collision on the interstate. 4 victims total. This one's male, mid-20s, possible internal bleeding and head trauma." Eleanor moved to Trauma Bay 1, where the team was assembling. Among them was a young man she hadn't seen before, presumably one of the new volunteer program participants. He looked barely old enough to have graduated college, with unruly dark hair and glasses that seemed too large for his face. He stood awkwardly to the side, wearing a volunteer badge that read, "Alex Chen." The ambulance doors burst open, and the paramedics wheeled in a man on a stretcher, blood soaking through the bandages wrapped around his head. The trauma team sprang into action, transferring him to the hospital bed as the paramedic rattled off vitals and initial assessment details. BP 90/60 and dropping, pulse 120, GCS 12. Responded to pain but becoming less coherent. Possible ruptured spleen based on abdominal rigidity. Eleanor moved efficiently, checking pupils, listening to lung sounds, palpating the abdomen. The patient winced, his face contorting in pain. "Get ultrasound in here. I need to see what's happening in the abdomen," she ordered, her voice calm but authoritative. The young volunteer, Alex, stepped forward. "Doctor, if I could suggest..." Eleanor turned sharply. "Who are you?" "Alex Chen. I'm part of the clinical observation program. I noticed his right upper quadrant shows signs of..." "This isn't a classroom," Eleanor cut him off, her voice like ice. "Stand back and observe, or leave. We don't have time for teaching moments while this man is bleeding out." Alex's face flushed, but he stepped back without another word. Eleanor returned her attention to the patient, whose vitals were deteriorating rapidly. The ultrasound confirmed her suspicions: significant internal bleeding, likely from a lacerated spleen. She ordered immediate prep for surgery and began rapid infusion protocols. "Type and cross for 4 units. Call up to OR and tell them we're coming. Start the massive transfusion protocol," she commanded. As the team mobilized, Eleanor caught Alex making notes on a small pad, his brow furrowed in concentration. Something about his intensity irritated her, the presumption of understanding in those untested eyes. "You," she said, pointing at him. "Make yourself useful. Help move equipment or step out of the way." "I believe he might also have a slow bleed from his liver," Alex said quietly. "The bruising pattern suggests..." Eleanor felt her patience snap, the audacity of this student questioning her assessment in the middle of a critical case. She stepped closer to him, keeping her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Listen carefully. I have performed over 3,000 trauma assessments and 800 emergency surgeries. This man's life depends on my experience, not on the theoretical musings of someone who's probably never seen a real trauma before today. If you want to play doctor, go back to your textbooks. In here, we deal with reality." The room fell silent, the only sounds the beeping monitors and the rushed preparations of the trauma team. Alex's face had gone pale, his eyes wide behind his glasses. For a moment, Eleanor felt a pang of regret for her harshness, but quickly pushed it aside. Medicine was no place for coddling egos. Lives depended on clarity and authority. "Dr. Mitchell," the surgical resident interrupted, Operating room 2 is ready for us. Eleanor nodded, turning her back on Alex as they prepared to move the patient. Let's move. He doesn't have much time. 4 hours later, Eleanor emerged from surgery, exhausted but satisfied. The patient was stable. They'd removed his ruptured spleen and, as it turned out, repaired a small tear in his liver as well. That detail nagged at her as she wrote up her surgical notes, but she dismissed it. It wasn't uncommon to discover additional injuries during surgery. The hospital cafeteria was nearly empty at 6:30 a.m. as Eleanor sat down with a cup of strong black coffee. The morning shift was just beginning, the night's emergencies giving way to the scheduled routines of the day. Dr. Thomas Wright, the chief of medicine, spotted her and made his way over. At 65, he was a legend in the hospital, respected not just for his medical brilliance, but for his humanistic approach to healthcare. "Rough night?" he asked, setting down his tray with a cup of tea and toast. Eleanor rubbed her eyes. "The usual, multiple traumas from a highway collision, one critical that we just finished in surgery." Thomas nodded. "I heard you had a run-in with one of our observers." Eleanor stiffened. "If you're referring to the volunteer who tried to diagnose my patient without any clinical experience, then yes, someone needed to teach him the boundaries." Thomas's expression remained neutral, but she detected a hint of disapproval. "That was Alex Chen." Should the name mean something to me? Eleanor took a sip of her coffee, the bitterness matching her mood. "Perhaps it should." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "He's not exactly a typical volunteer. Alex Chen graduated from Harvard Medical School at 19. He's published 12 peer-reviewed papers on trauma assessment techniques, and he's currently here as part of an exchange with Massachusetts General, where he's completing his surgical residency. At 24, he's already being courted by the WHO for his work on emergency medicine protocols in resource-limited settings." Eleanor felt the coffee turn cold in her stomach. "That's impossible. He looks like he just walked out of an undergraduate biology class." "And yet," Thomas said mildly, sliding a medical journal across the table. On the cover was a younger but unmistakable Alex Chen under the headline, "Revolutionizing Trauma Assessment. Dr. Alexander Chen's new protocol reduces mortality by 26%. Eleanor stared at the image, the realization of her error washing over her. Not just an error of identification, but of assumption, the very thing she prided herself on avoiding in medical diagnoses. "Why wasn't I informed?" she asked, her voice tight. "Would it have changed how you treated him?" Thomas asked. "We don't announce the credentials of every observer who comes through our doors. The purpose of the program is mutual learning, for them and for us." Eleanor felt the weight of her misjudgment settling on her shoulders. "He tried to tell me about a liver bleed. I dismissed him." "And did you find a liver bleed?" "Yes," she admitted. "A small one." Thomas nodded, standing up with his tray. "The board is considering him for a consulting position with our trauma center. His techniques are being adopted worldwide." He paused, looking down at her with gentle but unmistakable reproach. "Perhaps there's something to learn from this, Eleanor. Even the most brilliant lights can be obscured when we refuse to look beyond our own shadows." As Thomas walked away, Eleanor remained seated, staring at the journal cover. The young man's eyes looked back at her with the same intensity she'd dismissed just hours ago, eyes that had seen things her own years of experience hadn't revealed. For the first time in many years, Dr. Eleanor Mitchell felt the distinct discomfort of having been utterly wrong. The following week brought a peculiar tension to Boston General. News of Dr. Mitchell's confrontation with Alex Chen had spread through the hospital's corridors like a viral infection, transmitted in whispers between shifts and in meaningful glances in the cafeteria. Eleanor felt it everywhere, the subtle change in how staff interacted with her, the sudden silence when she entered rooms, the unspoken judgment. She stood now in the attendings' lounge, pouring herself another cup of coffee as she prepared for morning rounds. The television mounted on the wall was tuned to a medical news channel where a panel discussion on emergency trauma protocols was underway. Eleanor froze when Alex Chen's face appeared on the screen. "Dr. Chen, your rapid assessment protocol has been adopted by 17 countries in the past year alone," the host was saying. "What inspired this approach?" Alex's voice was soft but confident, entirely different from the hesitant tone he'd used in the ER. Medicine often focuses on complex solutions, but sometimes the answer lies in simplicity. By teaching first responders to recognize specific bruising patterns and physical markers, we can identify internal injuries much earlier, often before imaging is even available. Eleanor felt a colleague's eyes on her. Dr. Sarah Patel, a neurologist who'd been with the hospital for nearly as long as she had. "That's the wunderkind you dressed down in trauma, isn't it?" Sarah asked, her voice low enough that only Eleanor could hear. Eleanor didn't answer, keeping her eyes on her coffee. "Word is he correctly diagnosed that liver tear before you even ordered the ultrasound," Sarah continued. "Pretty impressive for someone you told to go back to his textbooks." "I didn't know who he was," Eleanor said tersely. "Would it have mattered?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've been doing this long enough to know we should evaluate ideas on merit, not credentials." The comment stung precisely because it was true. Eleanor had built her career on meritocracy, on the belief that medicine was about skill and knowledge, not titles or pedigrees. Yet she'd dismissed Alex solely based on his apparent youth and status. "I have patients to see," Eleanor said, leaving her coffee half-finished as she exited the lounge. Her morning rounds were mechanical, her mind elsewhere as she checked charts and examined patients. It was during her review of the trauma patient from that night, James Wilson, now recovering from surgery, that she encountered Alex Chen again. He was sitting beside the patient's bed, engaged in conversation when Eleanor entered. Both men looked up, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. "Dr. Mitchell," Alex said, standing. His demeanor was professional, showing no sign of their previous encounter. "I was just discussing Mr. Wilson's recovery plan." "I see," Eleanor said stiffly. "And why are you involved in this case?" "Dr. Wright asked me to consult," Alex replied evenly. "Mr. Wilson's case presents some interesting challenges for post-operative care given his unusual liver anatomy." James Wilson looked between them. Dr. Chen was explaining how they found that tear in my liver during surgery, said it could have been trouble if they'd missed it. Eleanor felt her face grow warm. "Yes, well, that's why we have thorough surgical protocols." Alex gathered his notes. "I've left my recommendations in the chart, Dr. Mitchell. Nothing radical, just some adjustments to the medication schedule based on his liver function tests." He nodded politely. "I'll leave you to your rounds." As he walked past her toward the door, Eleanor found herself speaking before she'd fully formed the thought. "Dr. Chen." He turned, his expression neutral. "I'd appreciate your thoughts on his recovery trajectory when you have time." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or a cautious reassessment. "Of course, I'd be happy to discuss it." After he left, Eleanor turned back to find James Wilson watching her curiously. "You didn't know who he was, did you?" "When I came in that night." Eleanor was taken aback by the directness of the question. "I'm sorry." "I was in and out of consciousness, but I remember what happened in the trauma bay. You shut him down pretty hard." Wilson adjusted himself in the bed, wincing slightly. "The nurses told me later who he is. Bit of a medical celebrity, apparently." Eleanor focused on checking his vitals monitor. "My priority was your immediate care, Mr. Wilson." "Sure," he said. "But you know what's funny? When I was being wheeled into surgery, he was the one who told me everything was going to be okay, said you were one of the best surgeons on the East Coast, despite what had just happened." Wilson gave her a pointed look. "That says something about a person, don't you think?" The comment caught Eleanor off guard. She finished her examination in silence, updating the chart before leaving the room. with a brief goodbye. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall, feeling suddenly drained. Her phone buzzed with a calendar notification. 3 p.m., board meeting, trauma center initiatives. She'd forgotten about the meeting entirely, unusual for her meticulously organized schedule. And now, knowing Alex Chen would likely be there, she felt a growing sense of dread. When Eleanor entered the conference room that afternoon, the board members were already assembled, along with Thomas Wright and, as expected, Alex Chen. Eleanor took the only available seat, directly across from Alex. "Dr. Mitchell, thank you for joining us," said Diane Forster, the board chairwoman. "We were just discussing Dr. Chen's proposals for updating our trauma assessment protocols." Eleanor nodded, avoiding Alex's gaze as she opened her tablet to review the meeting agenda. "As I was saying," Alex continued, "the initial data from hospitals that have implemented these methods shows a 23% reduction in misdiagnoses during high-volume trauma situations. The beauty of it is its simplicity. It requires minimal additional training for existing staff. And minimal additional cost," added Thomas, "which makes it particularly attractive." "What about accuracy?" Eleanor found herself asking. "Complex cases often present atypically. A simplified protocol might miss nuances that experienced clinicians would catch." It was the first direct challenge she'd made to his work, and she saw several board members glance between them, clearly aware of their previous encounter. Alex nodded thoughtfully. "A valid concern, Doctor Mitchell. That's why the protocol includes specific indicators for when cases should be escalated to senior clinicians. It's not meant to replace expertise. It's designed to enhance it by ensuring that initial assessments are consistently thorough." His response was measured and respectful, acknowledging her expertise rather than dismissing it. Eleanor felt a twist of shame at the contrast with her own behavior. "The data from Mass General is particularly compelling," Thomas added, sliding a report across the table. "They've been using Dr. Chen's methods for 8 months now." Eleanor scanned the numbers, her professional curiosity overriding her personal discomfort. The results were undeniably impressive. Decreased time to diagnosis, reduced unnecessary imaging, better patient outcomes. "Implementation would require a significant shift in our training approach," she noted, offering a practical rather than personal objection. "That's actually why I'm here," Alex said. "If the board approves, I'd be overseeing the training personally. A 2-week intensive program, followed by ongoing support." Eleanor looked up sharply. "You're joining Boston General?" Diane interjected. "Dr. Chen has accepted our offer for a 6-month consulting position, with potential for a permanent role afterward." The news settled over Eleanor like a weight. 6 months of working alongside the young doctor she'd humiliated. 6 months of being reminded of her error in judgment every time she saw him. The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur of presentations and discussions about logistics. Eleanor contributed where necessary, her professional instincts taking over despite her internal turmoil. When the meeting concluded, she gathered her materials quickly, intending to make a swift exit. "Dr. Mitchell," Alex's voice stopped her at the door. "Do you have a moment?" The boardroom had emptied, leaving just the two of them. Eleanor steeled herself, turning to face him. "Dr. Chen, congratulations on your new position." "Thank you." He gestured to the chairs. "Could we sit? There's something I'd like to discuss." Reluctantly, Eleanor took a seat, watching as he did the same across from her. "I want to be clear about something," Alex began. "What happened in the trauma bay? I harbor no ill feelings about it." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That's very gracious considering." "It's not about being gracious." Alex leaned forward slightly. "Emergency medicine is high pressure by nature. Split-second decisions, life and death stakes, exhaustion. It's not an environment conducive to perfect interpersonal interactions." "Most would consider it more than an imperfect interaction," Eleanor said, the admission painful but necessary. Alex shrugged. "Perhaps, but I've been on the receiving end of worse. and I've probably delivered my share as well. The point is, I don't want this hanging between us for the next 6 months." Eleanor studied him, trying to reconcile this measured, articulate man with the image of the awkward young volunteer she'd constructed in her mind. "Why did you tell James Wilson I was one of the best surgeons on the East Coast?" she asked suddenly. Surprise flickered across his face. "Because it's true. Your work on rapid trauma intervention techniques is foundational. I've studied your papers since medical school." The revelation was jarring. All this time, she'd been assuming his perception of her began and ended with their confrontation in the trauma bay. The idea that he'd known of her work, respected it even, made her misjudgment feel even more acute. "I didn't know," she said simply, "that I was familiar with your work. Any of it. Who you were, your background, your contributions." She met his gaze directly. "I made assumptions based on appearance and status. It was unprofessional and unfair." Alex was quiet for a moment. "If we're being honest, I could have introduced myself more clearly, gone through proper channels." "That doesn't excuse my response." "No," he agreed, "but it contextualizes it." He stood, gathering his materials. "I admire your work, Dr. Mitchell. I believe we could accomplish remarkable things together if we can move past this. The question is, can we?" Eleanor stood as well, feeling as though she was standing at a crossroads in her career, perhaps in her understanding of herself as a physician. "I'm willing to try," she said finally. Alex nodded, offering his hand. "Then let's start fresh. Dr. Alexander Chen, trauma specialist." After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor took his hand. "Dr. Eleanor Mitchell, cardiothoracic surgeon with apparently much to learn." A small smile curved his lips. "Aren't we all perpetual students, Dr. Mitchell? Isn't that the point of medicine?" As they walked out of the boardroom together, Eleanor felt a subtle shift. Not a resolution, but perhaps the beginning of one. The road ahead would be complicated, filled with the challenges of rebuilding professional respect and navigating a changed dynamic. But for the first time since that night in the trauma bay, she felt the weight of her error becoming something she could carry, something that might even, in time, become a catalyst for growth rather than a source of regret. 3 weeks into Alex Chen's tenure at Boston General, the hospital's trauma center was in the midst of transformation. Training sessions were underway, protocols were being updated, and a new energy seemed to permeate the department. Eleanor observed these changes with professional interest tempered by personal caution. She had attended the initial training sessions, sitting in the back row and taking meticulous notes, partly out of genuine interest and partly to demonstrate her willingness to adapt. Today, she found herself in Trauma Bay 3, working alongside Alex for the first time since their agreement to start fresh. A construction worker had fallen 3 stories, sustaining multiple fractures and possible internal injuries. The case was complex enough to warrant both their expertise. "BP's dropping, 90-50, called the trauma nurse. Eleanor moved efficiently, checking pupillary response while Alex assessed abdominal rigidity. "Fast scan is showing free fluid around the spleen," Alex reported. "But there's something else." He adjusted the ultrasound probe slightly. "Look at this, Doctor. Mitchell." Eleanor moved closer, examining the screen. "Subcapsular hematoma on the liver. Good catch." Their eyes met briefly over the patient, a moment of mutual professional respect that felt significant despite its simplicity. "OR3 is ready," announced the charge nurse. "You take lead on this one," Eleanor said to Alex. "It's your protocol that identified the dual injuries." Alex nodded, issuing directives to the team as they prepared to move the patient. Eleanor stepped back, allowing him to orchestrate the transition while adding her input where needed. Their collaboration was tentative but functional, a professional détente that was gradually replacing the tension of their first encounter. Hours later, the surgery completed successfully. They stood side by side at the sink, scrubbing out. "Your technique on that liver repair was impressive," Eleanor commented, keeping her tone casual. "I haven't seen that approach before." A modification I developed during my work in rural Indonesia, Alex replied. Limited resources necessitate creativity. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Indonesia? That wasn't in your file. I spent a year there after my accelerated residency. The WHO placed me with a mobile surgical unit. Alex dried his hands, his expression thoughtful. It changes your perspective, performing complex procedures with basic tools and unreliable electricity. Eleanor found herself genuinely curious. Is that where you developed your trauma assessment protocol? Alex nodded. The beginnings of it. When you can't rely on immediate imaging, you learn to read the body's external signs with incredible precision. As they walked together toward the recovery area, Eleanor realized this was the longest conversation they'd had that wasn't strictly about hospital business. There was something refreshing about discussing medicine as a shared passion rather than a battlefield of competing expertise. Dr. Chen, Dr. Mitchell. Thomas Wright intercepted them in the hallway, his expression grave. I'm glad I found you both. We have a situation developing in the ER. Another trauma case? Eleanor asked. Multiple traumas, Thomas corrected. There's been a building collapse downtown, a partial failure of the structural supports in the old Benson building during renovation. We're expecting at least 15 critical patients, possibly more. The information shifted both doctors instantly into emergency response mode. How far out? Alex asked. First ambulances are 8 minutes away. I'm activating our mass casualty protocol. Thomas looked between them. I need you both coordinating the trauma response. Given the nature of the injuries, crushing wounds, potential compartment syndrome, multiple fractures, your combined expertise is essential. Eleanor and Alex exchanged a glance. They'd been working parallel to each other these past weeks, but this would require true collaboration, seamless teamwork in the most high-pressure environment possible. We'll handle it, Eleanor said, already mentally preparing for the challenges ahead. Thomas nodded. Good. Dr. Mitchell, you'll coordinate surgical teams. Dr. Chen, you'll oversee initial assessment and triage. Work together on priority cases. As Thomas hurried away to continue preparations, Eleanor turned to Alex. We should establish a clear workflow before they arrive. Agreed. Let's use the new assessment protocol for initial triage, but we'll need to modify it for mass casualty conditions. They walked briskly toward the emergency department, rapidly discussing strategy and delegation of responsibilities. Despite the gravity of the situation, Eleanor felt a surprising sense of confidence in their ability to work together. Their different perspectives and skills seemed complementary rather than conflicting. 8 minutes later, the first ambulances arrived. The emergency department transformed into a controlled chaos of medical teams, equipment, and critically injured patients. Eleanor and Alex moved through the space like conductors of an orchestra, directing resources, making split-second decisions, and occasionally consulting each other on particularly complex cases. Construction worker, male, 30s, announced a paramedic, wheeling in a man covered in dust and blood. Trapped under a support beam for approximately 20 minutes. Crush injuries to lower extremities, possible tension pneumothorax. Alex performed a rapid assessment, using his protocol methods while Eleanor checked the patient's chest. Definite pneumothorax, she confirmed. Diminished breath sounds on the right, tracheal deviation. I need a chest tube here, Alex called to a nearby resident. Then to Eleanor. His right leg shows signs of compartment syndrome. We need to check pressures immediately. Eleanor nodded, already preparing for the procedure. I'll decompress the chest first, then we can assess the extremities. They worked in tandem, their previous tension replaced by professional synchronicity. When Eleanor successfully placed the chest tube, relieving the pressure and stabilizing the patient's breathing, Alex gave her a brief nod of approval before moving on to measure compartment pressures in the injured leg. Pressures are critical. We need fasciotomy now, he announced. O2 is ready, Eleanor responded. I'll call up the vascular team to meet us there. As they prepared to move the patient, another arrived, a young woman with a penetrating abdominal wound from rebar. "I'll take this one," Alex said to Eleanor. "You get him to OR2. For 7 hours, they continued this dance of coordinated emergency care, moving between patients, consulting on difficult cases, dividing responsibilities based on their specialties. By the time the last critical patient had been stabilized or moved to surgery, both doctors were exhausted but satisfied with their response. They found themselves in the staff break room at 3 a.m., both too wired from adrenaline to leave despite their exhaustion. Eleanor poured 2 cups of coffee, sliding one across the table to Alex. "Your protocol worked," she said simply. "We identified priorities accurately, moved patients efficiently. I think we saved at least 3 people who might have been lost in the shuffle of a traditional triage approach." Alex wrapped his hands around the warm cup. "It wasn't just the protocol. Your surgical prioritization was spot on. That construction worker with the pneumothorax and compartment syndrome, timing was everything there." A comfortable silence fell between them, the shared experience of the mass casualty event creating a strange intimacy, the kind that exists only between people who have faced extraordinary circumstances together. "Why medicine?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "With your intelligence, you could have excelled in any field. Why choose one with such brutal hours and emotional toll?" Alex looked surprised by the personal question, but considered it thoughtfully. "My mother was a rural doctor in a small town outside Seattle. She used to take me on house calls sometimes, let me carry her bag, taught me to take pulses when I was 6. A smile touched his lips at the memory. "I saw how she could transform a room just by walking into it, how fear would recede, how hope would appear, even when the prognosis wasn't good." Eleanor found herself nodding. The privilege of being present at people's most vulnerable moments. "Exactly." Alex looked at her curiously. "And you? What drew you to medicine, specifically trauma surgery?" Eleanor rarely discussed her personal motivations, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But something about the shared intensity of the night, the gradual dismantling of the walls between them, made her answer honestly. "My brother died when I was 12. Car accident. He made it to the hospital alive but died during surgery." She took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste grounding her in the present. "The surgeon came out and told us they'd done everything possible, but I remember thinking that everything possible wasn't enough. I wanted to expand the definition of what was possible." Alex's expression showed understanding without pity, the response of someone who had seen enough death to respect its impact. "And have you? Expanded what's possible?" "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted. "Not always. Medicine has a way of humbling even the most ambitious among us." "That it does," Alex agreed. He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think your brother would be proud of the doctor you've become." The comment caught Eleanor off guard. Too personal, perhaps, from someone who was still largely a colleague rather than a friend. Yet instead of bristling, she found herself appreciating his ability to acknowledge the human beneath the professional. "Thank you," she said simply. Their conversation was interrupted by Dr. Wright, who entered looking as tired as they felt, but with an air of satisfaction. 17 critical patients all stabilized, 15 already in recovery or ICU, he announced. "No fatalities so far, that's remarkable work." "It was a team effort," Alex said. Thomas looked between them, noting their shared table and the ease that had replaced their earlier tension. "Indeed it was. I had a feeling you two would work well together given the chance." He poured himself a cup of coffee. "The board is impressed with how smoothly the new protocols integrated with our existing systems. They're discussing expanding the program." Eleanor found herself nodding. "The modified assessment approach saved us critical minutes with several patients. I'd support its full implementation." Thomas raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her endorsement. "That's good to hear, because they're considering making Dr. Chen's position permanent with expanded responsibilities that would include working directly with your department on integrated trauma care." Eleanor glanced at Alex, who looked equally surprised by this news. A month ago, the prospect of having him as a permanent colleague, potentially with authority that overlapped her own, would have been threatening. Now, after seeing his work firsthand, after beginning to understand the person behind the prodigy, she found herself calculating the medical benefits rather than the personal complications. "I think that would be valuable for the hospital," she said carefully. Alex's expression showed a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal uncertainty, an acknowledgement that while their working relationship had improved dramatically, they were still navigating unfamiliar territory. "Nothing's decided yet," Thomas assured them, "but today's performance will certainly factor into the evaluation." He finished his coffee and headed for the door. "Both of you should get some rest. You've earned it." After he left, a new thoughtful silence fell between Eleanor and Alex. The possibility of a long-term professional relationship hung in the air, neither entirely comfortable nor unwelcome. "Would you really be okay with that?" Alex asked finally. "Working together on a permanent basis?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "A month ago, no," she admitted. "Now, I think we've proven we can do good work together. That's what matters." "Is it?" Alex's gaze was direct. "Because hospitals are more than just medicine. They're people, relationships, histories. I don't want to disrupt something that works just because my methods are new." Eleanor was struck by his self-awareness, the recognition that innovation alone wasn't enough, that medical communities were complex ecosystems where change needed to be integrated thoughtfully. "You're not disrupting," she said finally. "You're expanding what's possible. Isn't that what we all aim for?" The echo of her own earlier words about her brother wasn't lost on either of them. Alex nodded slowly, understanding the significance of what she was offering, not just professional acceptance, but a kind of respect that went beyond credentials or achievements. "Then I guess we'll see what the board decides," he said. As they gathered their things to leave, both finally succumbing to the exhaustion of the day, Eleanor realized that something fundamental had shifted. The young doctor she had humiliated in the trauma bay had become someone whose opinion she valued, whose skills she respected, whose presence she might even welcome as a permanent fixture in her professional life. It wasn't friendship, not yet. It wasn't even complete reconciliation. But it was a beginning, a recognition that sometimes the most valuable medical partnerships were forged in the crucible of crisis, where personal differences became secondary to the shared mission of saving lives. 6 months later, Boston General Hospital's annual medical conference was underway. The grand ballroom of the Westfield Hotel had been transformed into an elegant venue for the gala dinner that traditionally closed the 3-day event. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space, centered with arrangements of blue hydrangeas and white roses. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the assembled medical professionals, all dressed in formal attire, a stark contrast to their usual scrubs and lab coats. At a table near the front, Eleanor sat beside Alex, both listening as Thomas Wright delivered his keynote address. The past 6 months had seen remarkable changes at Boston General. The trauma center had been completely revitalized under their joint leadership, with Alex accepting the permanent position as Director of Trauma Innovation, while Eleanor continued her role as Chief of Emergency Surgery. What had begun as a reluctant collaboration had evolved into a partnership respected throughout the hospital. "And so," Thomas was saying, "it is with great pride that I announce Boston General's trauma response times have decreased by 31% over the past 6 months, with patient outcomes improving by a comparable margin. This remarkable achievement is the direct result of the innovative protocols developed by Dr. Alexander Chen and implemented under the joint leadership of Dr. Chen and Dr. Eleanor Mitchell." Applause filled the room. Eleanor glanced at Alex, who returned her look with a small smile of shared accomplishment. They had come a long way from that first confrontation in the trauma bay. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, "the American College of Emergency Physicians has selected their integrated trauma response system as a model program to be presented at the International Conference in Geneva this fall." More applause, louder this time. Eleanor felt a surge of professional pride. The program had indeed exceeded all expectations, combining Alex's innovative assessment techniques with her surgical expertise to create something greater than either could have achieved alone. As Thomas concluded his speech and dinner was served, conversation flowed around their table. Eleanor found herself engaged in discussion with the hospital's newest cardiology fellow, a promising young doctor who reminded her somewhat of herself 20 years earlier. Ambitious, perhaps a bit too rigid in her thinking. Dr. Mitchell, the fellow Dr. Rebecca Wong, began, "I've been studying your paper on rapid intervention for traumatic cardiac tamponade. The approach you developed has become standard practice." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Though these days, we're finding that integrating Dr. Chen's assessment protocols allows us